Welcome, everyone. On behalf of Everlaw, I want to thank everyone for joining us and being here today to discuss this very, very important topic. We are going to talk about really how to unlock efficiency in internal investigations, kind of going from crisis response to real confident decision making. As we know, internal investigations are at the front lines of crisis response for organizations, placing general counsel as well as others in the hot seat for rapid, high-stakes decisions. Efficient internal investigations, whether triggered by a data breach, a whistleblower complaint, a subpoena, or other factors, demand meticulous planning. Legal, HR, and compliance teams must define investigation goals, the scope, the business impact mitigation, external counsel involvement, and of course, potential public disclosure. The choices made by a general counsel at the outset wield considerable influence over the investigation's speed, its success, and its cost. So today, I'm going to go over the agenda very briefly. We have the privilege of two very distinguished experts who are going to bring unique perspectives to this webinar. I have a very accomplished forensic investigator with us who has extensive experience in the trenches of digital forensics, and of course, a seasoned law partner who is going to provide legal expertise, guiding organizations through complex investigations, and also talking about compliance and decision-making as well. So together, we're all going to have that comprehensive view, blending their respective skills and insights to shed light on best practices, challenges, and strategies. So, what are we going to talk about today specifically? So we are going to set the scene. We're really going to walk through what are some of these challenges that we're seeing. We are going to define problems that folks in this space are facing, whether from the law firm side, the general counsel side, from the forensic side. We're going to talk about all of those things. We're also going to talk about what a strong investigations team looks like. Who should you have? Oftentimes, it just depends. It's going to depend on the scope of the problem that you're dealing with and the issue that you're investigating. We're going to talk about data, and more data, and data collection, and how important this is when we're talking about investigations. And of course, we cannot have this conversation without talking about generative AI. And we're going to talk about some best practices, and then we're going to leave you with a few top takeaways. So before we get into this, let me introduce who our speakers are. So first of all, I'm Gina Jerba. I am an attorney. I am a senior content executive here at Everlaw, and I am your moderator for today. But let's go ahead and start with Steve Davis. Steve, you're the VP in Forensics and Investigations lead at Purpose Legal, but tell us more about you, what you do, who you are. And
yeah, whenever I do these presentations, I always tell people I'm not an attorney. So unique out of this grouping, but my background as a former federal investigator was with the quasi-governmental organization, the Resolution Trust Corporation, back in the late 80s, early 90s, closing down financial institutions and S&Ls and doing investigations. So my background segued into forensics from really investigations originally. And now I have about 17 years of hands-on forensics. A lot of my experience came back in the days of we were looking at paper, and we didn't even have a lot of electronic devices or electronically stored information, ESI as we call it. But now I've segued and worked with practitioners like Brock doing investigations from kind of cradle to grave, collecting data, doing forensic investigations, and then mitigating or minimizing data so that humans can actually look at it.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. Brock Bosson, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself as well?
Sure. Thanks, Gina, and thanks to Everlaw for organizing this event. I'm Brock Bosson. I'm a partner at Cahill, Gordon & Reindel, where I chair our corporate governance and compliance advisory practice. And my work focuses on internal investigations, enforcement actions, M&A due diligence on key compliance areas like anti-corruption, money laundering, sanctions, and reputational risk. And I also focus on helping companies enhance their compliance programs, often in parallel with an investigation or a post-acquisition integration process. I started my legal career as a lawyer in the U.S. Army JAG Corps, where I was a prosecutor in military courts and a special assistant U.S. attorney in civilian federal courts. And I conducted compliance assessments and develop compliance programs for certain types of operations from the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan. I've been at Cahill for nearly 12 years, where the investigations I handle are large and small, some that have a media component and are in parallel with a government investigation, and some are smaller internal investigations, discrete in both senses of the word. And that'll play, I think, into the discussion today, because there are different paths that can be taken in an investigation. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Excellent, excellent. Well, this is really exciting again to have the both of you to have your perspectives here. I think we're going to get a lot out of this today. But before we do, let's set the scene. Let's really talk about let's define the scope of the problem, and talk about, when we talk about the purpose of an investigation, really what is it? What are its objectives? And really how to define that. So let's start, Brock, with you and have you discuss a little bit about the purpose of an investigation, like when you really are getting called in on cases like this.
Sure. So these can arise from a number of sources. The purpose overall is to identify wrongdoing or identify errors, identify opportunities to enhance controls. As we've all seen, there's never a perfect rollout of a compliance and control program or function. It has to be tested over time, and the issues that come up in investigations expose opportunities for improvement. These things can come up from anything from a government subpoena, interest from a government regulator, internal hotline report, internal audit, things that are investigated or identified during ongoing testing, maybe even something from an investigative journalist. But to me, at the end of the day, an investigation is about business continuity in a way, and how to enhance the operations so that the business can continue, but do so in a compliant way. I'm very much a believer that compliance is compliance is good business, and investigations are a healthy way of achieving that.
Absolutely. And I think that answers my next question, which was for you, which is going to be, how do you really define success in these type of investigations? Also, they're all very different and unique and individual, but if you could sum up how you would define success, what would you say?
Yeah, well, I think that it's a very important point, and it's something that should not be overlooked at the beginning of an investigation, which is to identify the objectives. And that's advantageous for a lot of reasons. Number one is it drives efficiency for the client, because that way you don't have kind of scope creep investigation. You don't have a meandering investigation. You should be very thoughtful and deliberate at the beginning as to what your investigative objectives are. And that can evolve. Those can be modified during the course of the investigation based on where the facts take you. But again, that should be a deliberate process if there are going to be changes to the objectives. And the other thing that I think is important about that at the front end is it's critical, if there's ever scrutiny of an investigation later, that someone has reviewed whether those objectives have been achieved, and someone's accountable for seeing whether those objectives have been achieved. I think that's just all part of the good health and integrity of an investigation. So we'll get into this, but that is a key element of the work plan.
Mm-hmm. That's the piece about scrutiny, particularly, is important. Yeah, if you do get scrutinized later or have any scrutiny, making sure that you have those objectives defined and at the outset is key. Steve, let's ask you too. I mean, you're coming at this from, an investigation, really digging into that data on the technical side. Tell me a little bit about, what you see as really what you're brought in, the purpose of the investigation on your end, and then like how you define that success too.
Yeah, I think of it kind of like a math problem or a stats problem where I come in with a theorem. So either we're trying to prove something or disprove something. And you usually maybe they feed you the answer, maybe they don't feed you the answer, and they give you some of the variables or constants or factors that are involved. And then it's kind of like a puzzle, and maybe that's sophomoric, but I think it's a matter of putting together the pieces, and you need to underwrite what you need to get there. I think Brock said it more eloquently. I always make the joke about, my wife says, how long does it take to get there? And I always ask her, where are we going? Mm-hmm. Because once you know where you're going, and once you have a work plan and you define, I think Brock's point on that you have to define so that you don't have the scope creep, and you don't have spend to budget. Instead, what you do is you try to put, guardrails around it, so you know what you're trying to achieve, and you're thoughtful within the confines of getting an answer, but also getting an answer in a reasonable period of time and using means that are acceptable and defensible from a forensic standpoint.
Yeah, and when you're talking about scope creep too, it's like, with the information that you have at the time of the investigation's commencement, I think that's where, it can expand later as you're learning more, of course, and I'm sure you've both had that happen, but defining it to the best of your ability at the beginning is, I think, key there. Well, let's go again also talk more about the problem and the scope and some really real early decisions. When you're first brought in general, how do you approach things? Like, what are some of the key decisions that first need to be made at the beginning? And Steve, maybe this time we'll start with you and have you talk about, when you're brought in by an organization, what are you tackling first? What are you looking at first?
Yeah, I try to frame the conversation. I always use the analogy of kind of a three-legged stool. So I try to frame it, first of all, are we talking about 10 years, 100 years? Are we talking about 3 months? Like, how long is the time frame that we're interested in? Because that will impact the people that may have been involved, or maybe custodial individuals, maybe people of interest, maybe people, ex-employees and the like, that we may or may not have access to their information. So number one is time. That'll help then also dictate who are those custodians, who are people that we may want to either interview or get access to information that they have. And the way they have information is usually twofold. One would be physical devices like a phone or a computer they use or a repository they tap into. And the second would be data sources, things like Microsoft 365 or Google Workspace or Confluence or Jira or Slack or WeChat or Viber, and all those flavors of communication and collaboration platforms. So if you know time and you know custodians, and then you know what data sources or devices are involved, I think that puts that guardrail or puts the fence around what you're going to have to achieve.
Yeah, and same question for you, Brock, too. I mean, I think you would probably agree with most of what Steve's saying there.
Sure. Yeah, of course. I think it's critical at the outset of an investigation to be as efficient as possible. The clients want the investigation to move forward quickly. If the government's involved, they want the investigation to move forward quickly. And so I often try to get as much information as possible, as quickly as possible. And that also can help inform the work plan, the sequence of collection, how you're going to go about your core fact finding. And so to unpack that a bit, I think it's important to listen to your client, hear what the client has to say. Certain business operators, to the extent that you can speak with them while maintaining the integrity of the investigation, develop some initial theories, identify who is talking to who. We may get into this later, but I think that's an area where AI could potentially provide some benefit as you look at initial data sets and you link who is speaking to who in emails and so forth. That gives you an early idea of who you may want to be talking to. And so in terms of early decisions, who are my initial interviews? What are the initial document review? What's that going to look like? Something that we often undertake is initial scoping interviews, initial document review, where we get like the most keywords, the ones that we think are going to be the highest value, and run some very early searches to see if we can get some direction on an investigation. And from there, in terms of early decisions, the sequencing of review, how you're going to go about collecting that information, which can be quite sensitive, and how you do it. And as we'll get into as well, in addition to scoping being your friend and driving efficiency, it's also important to memorialize everything that you're doing in this process.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I guess my next question is there anything in this process that if you could, you're giving advice or not advice, but you're giving tips to people that are listening today. Nothing is legal advice that we're giving today. But is there anything that's overlooked or underestimated as you're going through this? Steve, let me ask you that question.
Yeah, I think that's I use the joke about, back in the day, a lawyer would call me and say, hey, I have 5 gigs of data that I need you to look at. And I'd be like, do you? I mean, maybe you do, and maybe you don't. Maybe there's a lot more there. So we think of two things, and Brock and I had chatted about this previously, and that's both residency of data and then redundancy of data. So residency of data is where are the dead bodies buried? Is it email? Is it collaboration platforms? Is it hard copy documents? Is it pictures? Is it structured databases? So first thing we have to do is identify where things live. And then I think one of those gotchas or one of those items that you really need to be careful about is this concept of redundancy. So redundancy is a fancy word for kind of backups or syncs that can exist. But I had one case where we were collecting hundreds and hundreds of phones from different individuals on a large tort matter. And one of the people called me and said, hey, my phone flew into the pool last night, so I don't have it anymore. And I was like, okay, I get it. And things like that happen. But do you ever sync, your phone to either the iCloud or back it up to your computer? So when you go work out, you have music. He's, oh yeah, do that all the time. I said, great. So we were able to, I'm not sure he wanted to answer that way, but we were able to then identify a secondary or tertiary location where data may live. So this concept of redundancy, and we're going to talk about some issues later, like ephemeral texting. The concept of redundancy sometimes takes a snapshot, like a balance sheet snapshot in time, that allows you to get to evidence that otherwise wouldn't exist. So I think that's a very important concept.
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
think that's right. It goes
sorry.
beyond email, as Steve is saying. 10 years ago when we would do investigations, when we do custodial interviews, and if there was a person of interest in an investigation or a key witness, you would want to see what types of documents they have, so you knew the universe of what you could take a look at. And in those days, we would ask, well, do you have any hard copy documents at home? Do you have any, do you keep any in your car? And now the questions are more like, what messaging apps do you use? Do you ever use chat over any video conferencing platforms? Do you have the cloud backup, like Steve said? And I think, now there's a lot more creativity involved in identifying all the sources of data that are out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And, data is, like I think Steve said a moment ago, data isn't necessarily lost because a phone falls in a pool. Like, there are multiple places it could be. So that complicates in some ways the investigation more. But I think, again, with years of experience between the two of you, it's something that you would recognize pretty quickly, I think.
Yeah, and I would just jump and piggyback onto that to say that two other concepts. One is Brock's right. The data becomes more elusive, right? This is harder to capture the little mouse that's running around and put the cup over it, because now we're not exactly sure. It's not, de facto that we're going to go to get email necessarily. And if it is email, maybe it's a different flavor of email, and maybe it's personal email, not corporate email anymore. So that's a very important thing. Also data sizes are overwhelming. Remember, 10, 20 years ago, we talked about big data. Well, that's a joke. I mean, now it's, the ideas of terabytes, and now it's petabytes and beyond that we're dealing with. I mean, literally my first computer was 20 meg, and all my daughters have got 4 and 5 terabyte backups. And so, the practical application, the practical implication to a client is that's a whole lot of money for a practitioner like Brock to look at, or even to host it in a platform or ingest it. So we have to be very mindful and thoughtful, and we have to understand the tools and techniques that are out there, so we don't just get who moved the cheese, that mound of cheese. We've got to mitigate and minimize and hone in, and I think that's where the pre-planning really comes in.
Yep. Anything else, Brock, that you wanted to add on to Steve's point?
I think, this is a point as well where there's a bit of the art of the investigation, because when you identify potentially relevant sources that might be on someone's personal phone or on their personal computer, there's growing expectations and sometimes shifting policy on what the government expects the company to collect, or what the restrictions are on use of personal devices related to company business. But all those things need to be considered in an investigation. And what you can often run into is where an executive, a manager, someone who's relevant to the investigation says, you can look at my text messages or look at certain text messages. You can't look at my photos. You can't look at this part of data. I never use this app for work purposes. And sometimes you have to navigate that. Sometimes you have to be practical, and you don't want to make perfect the enemy of the effective. And DOJ will often, and the SEC will expect bring your own device policies to be consistently applied, and there can always be scrutiny over what you collected, what you didn't collect. But at the end of the day, there has to be a risk-based decision made about if we didn't make some compromises in certain scenarios, we wouldn't have any data at all. And so I think that's a focus, is what is going to make the investigation most effective, given what limitations may arise in gathering information. And that, again, comes back to the point of memorializing. You may need to explain someday why you collected certain information, why you didn't, and how you navigated that.
And with the example you gave, of the person who doesn't want you looking at their personal photos, but it could be something that there could be data in there that you need. I mean, how do you go about explaining that to a very resistant individual? Do you have any advice on that?
Yeah. So I'll take a step back to scoping as well. So I mentioned earlier how we might, in our investigations, run some preliminary searches for scoping, getting a lay of the land. Sometimes the keywords that you might include are text me. You might name a messaging app to see if there's any indication of people taking things offline to one of those apps that would give you a direction. And if you have something like that, of course you have, I think, a pretty obvious flag that that's something that you would need to take a look at in some scenarios. But I think that in many cases, executives, employees understand that they are expected to cooperate with an investigation, and there are personal imperatives and considerations as well. But I think that transparency with the investigative process, talking through the investigations and the company's need to look at that material, and finding a solution to where they can be comfortable. Sometimes that involves having someone from our firm sit down with them and look at their contacts and see which contacts could potentially be relevant, maybe do some spot checking of the ones that they say are not relevant to ensure that it indeed does not involve company business. There's a lot of creativity to this, and there's no one size fits all approach. But it's, as I said, a risk-based way of finding a path that stays effective, keeps people comfortable where that's necessary, and withstands scrutiny.
Well, let's talk about a little bit more on just the beginning phases, the pre-investigation or the preliminary stages of this investigation, and then we'll start moving on into the real, I think, meat and potatoes of this. But I'd like to talk about building a strong investigations team. And what does a good investigation team look like? In many scenarios, it's going to look like having at least the two of you representative there. But I'd like to hear more. And I think the answer to this is it's going to depend. I think we talked about this in one of our pre-planning calls. A lot of this is it depends. But I'd like to, Steve, from your point of view, what does a good investigation, team look like, especially when it involves a lot of complex data?
Yeah, I was thinking earlier of an adjunct question, which is, why do you retain a Brock or why do you retain a Steve? And I think sometimes it's because we speak multi-languages, not languages, necessarily like Spanish or Portuguese and English and all that, but rather we have to be able to speak IT, we have to be able to speak forensics, we have to be able to speak legal, and then we also have to be able to speak IT directly with their stakeholders, so the business people. So there's a lot of people that have an interest in an investigation, and they have differing levels and layers of expertise. So you've got to be able to speak up and down the path, and you have to be able to do it in an authentic way. I think independence and objectivity obviously strike me. I would serve zero purpose from a matter of providing legal advice, so I'm no benefit there. But I think Brock would probably agree that certain lawyers probably don't have the ability to talk bit by bit forensic imaging and structured database extraction. So I think it takes kind of the village. It takes several people of different disciplines. And I think when you're building a team, it's the old, fox in the hen house. I think you want to steer clear of custodians and companies kind of collecting their own stuff. Obviously, there's big companies out there that I work with that have a staff of people like me employed, and there's nothing wrong with them doing that work and collecting it. But when we're dealing with investigations, whether it's a shadow investigation or government investigation, many times it's important to bring in a third-party objective observer who can also then validate, authenticate, and testify down the road. So I think you need to be thoughtful. And also, how big is this problem? Are we fighting over, $100,000? Are we fighting over the existence of the company? And in those cases, that may also indicate how you go about building your team.
Yep. And Brock, the same question for you. I mean, when we're talking about the challenges for, and strategies for having an effective team, we're talking, I know we're involving legal, there's HR involved, compliance can be involved, external investigators are involved. But anything else to add on to that?
Yeah, so a few layers, as you just pointed out. So maybe first, when to involve outside counsel. I think that it's something that should be strongly considered whenever there is alleged senior management involvement in the alleged misconduct as an initial matter. If there's any potential criminal liability or significant civil liability or significant reputational risk to the company, these are all things that I think warrant consideration of outside counsel, in partial measure to reinforce the privilege that would be put in place around the investigation to follow. When you think about technical advisors as well, I think once it's known that there's going to be any kind of significant document review, if there's document review that is going to go beyond emails on the company's servers, or if there's going to be media of various data types, I think it's helpful to bring in someone like Steve at that point as well. There are plenty of investigations out there that you can get to the bottom of them by looking at a few emails and talking to a few people. Those are different situations, but where you think you need to quickly collect someone's phone and send someone like Steve to their house and image it right there, or if you're dealing with, you're going to be dealing with extraction of data from video conferencing platforms or messaging apps, that's when it's important to get someone on the technical side involved early. And I think you touched on a really important point, Gina, about a kind of a multidisciplinary team. And this has to be navigated on a case-by-case basis. But if there is a media component, you may need to involve your government affairs, your PR team. If there is some sort of fallout or impact with your employees, you may need to get HR involved, and that's something that just has to be worked out as the investigation runs its course. And something that I would be remiss if I didn't touch on, is I think it's very important to the extent you can, is to implement compliance enhancements parallel with the investigation. Sometimes investigations take some time, and it's certainly preferable to close any gaps you identify during the course of the investigation, rather than waiting till the very end.
And I think going back to something you said earlier, documenting. So if there is a compliance gap, like making sure this is all getting documented, everything is there for review, if need be, if you need to refer to it later.
Exactly. Yeah. And if there is scrutiny, not just on the investigation, but on the company later, I think it makes for a very good record to say, look, we immediately implemented these compliance enhancements and we tested them in this fashion. It shows a great tone from the top and the company's commitment.
Right. And the good faith of the company in trying to remediate. Well, let's talk about, we're calling it data collection snafus, but data collection is such a big part of this, as we've been talking about it for the last couple of minutes here. I want to talk about just like preserving data and ensuring that chain of custody, which is extremely important. What are some common missteps you've seen at this critical stage around handling digital evidence and talking about some best practices? So Steve, let's start with you.
Yeah, one of the CLEs I've taught on the last few years is called The Dangers of Do-It-Yourself Collections. And once again, it's not that people are inherently evil or bad. It's just that sometimes they don't have the tools and techniques or the bandwidth or the ability to do the collections in a forensically defensible manner. And sometimes what we say is trample on the evidence, a fancy word is spoliation, on the evidence they have. So either cherry picking, going in and moving things like, hey, I'll move all these pictures from this location to that location and send them over to Brock. Well, the problem is, by doing that, depending on how you do that, may or may not modify the metadata, which is the data about the data that forensic experts argue about and lawyers rely on sometimes. So we need to have a plan. We need to have a defensible way to do it. We need to have this contemporaneous recordation of what we do. So all the acquisition forms, all the chain of custody documents all go to our internal blog so that, down the road, a year, 2 years, 7 years later, when we're arguing about the process, we understand what was done, how it was done, was it defensible, did it match on a hash value basis, which is a mathematical way to ensure that the data going into the machine is the same as the data coming out of the machine. So there's just tried and true industry standard ways to go about collecting things. Forensics means from Latin to bring evidence or data to the forum. It's what neighbors did back in the day, is they bring the data, and that's what we do. People laugh sometimes that I'm a private investigator. Like, why? When I was coaching soccer, my kids would be like, Coach Steve, you have a gun? I was like, no, I don't have a gun. I bring evidence to court. And so I'm a forensic guy, but I have to be a licensed private investigator in many of the states, including like New York and Texas and Michigan, South Carolina, Illinois, require you to do so that you can be independent, but also that you're taught how to do your job and make it defensible and make sure it is black and white and not just gray.
Yep. Brock, same question for you.
So, you ask questions like this, and war stories come to mind of what the exact snafus were. But I do think there are lessons that can be drawn from a lot of things. And so, Steve had a line that he used, the dangers of DIY collection, and I think that resonates. There have been certain instances, especially as the volume, the volume, the capacity of the collections grows. This can be a time-consuming process sometimes, and the custodian needs to be prepared for that. You can have instances where you're gathering large amounts of data. It times out somewhere in the middle. You have to start over. There have been instances that you need to look out for where certain folders will be taken, but there could be gaps, inadvertent gaps in the information that was collected. And so I think one thing I would throw out there is the importance of QC, quality checks, on the data that's been collected. There have been instances where folks that I'm working with here at Cahill will perform spot checks on the data that has been collected and identify, hey, we are missing 2 months in 2017, or we're missing this custodian where we thought we had it. And so I think that's important as part of the process as you go about the investigation, because you want to recognize those things as early as possible. And sometimes there's a ghost in the machine sometimes to where those things just happen, and you have to look around corners and see where they may pop up.
And how much of this, though, can you rely on IT and really, I mean, I guess you're gonna, I think you said this earlier, Steve, it's like being able to communicate with IT about very technical issues. What are your thoughts on that, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, IT obviously very good at what they do, but their jobs are usually the continuity. They're usually business operation continuity. They keep things working. They issue new computers. They're brilliant people, but they're not necessarily forensic people. So doing a snapshot collection of information and then normalizing it or parsing it and making it, putting it in a manner where you can get into an Ediscovery platform that then practitioners are going to review is a whole different skill set. And sometimes it's a huge burden when they're trying to keep their day job and keep things running in these multinational corporations. Then we run in and ask them to do a bunch of stuff that's hair on fire 911, because that's what we're up against. And it's kind of difficult for them. I find that when we are sensitive to what they do day in and day out, and we communicate with them and not at them, that they're much more likely to cooperate with you. And that's where collaboration, that's my whole life. I mean, I'm not very smart, but I'm really good at getting along with people. So when you're working on a project, you need to collaborate and you need to be sensitive to how people feel. They feel exactly how they feel that day. And you've got to break down the barriers so that we can collectively achieve our goals. So working with IT is paying the requisite, respect to them, but also, offering to help them in any way you can to provide services, tools, and techniques that maybe they don't have.
Yep, obviously IT plays a very, very big role, as you said, but their objective is running the business versus what you are all doing. So we love our IT people, but that's, I think, the difference here in the scope of what they're doing. Another question about this, and I think we talked about it a little bit earlier, but the privacy issue and privacy concerns. Brock, we had the example of the person who was worried about their photographs, right, and didn't want those, to be reviewed. But what are some privacy concerns that have come up outside of just the photograph piece? And then how do you ensure your clients that their privacy will be taken into consideration? Brock, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Steve.
Yeah, it's often on a case-by-case approach with individual custodians. If someone is pushing back on a collection, and you've always got in your mind that this investigation needs to be defensible and withstand scrutiny. And so I think this is one of the areas in investigations where creativity comes the most into play. So you asked where this has come up besides photos. It's come up with texts. Someone will say, I'm fine with you looking at my texts for people with work, but not my spouse. I don't use this messaging app for work. Trust me on that. And then just, don't worry about that one. And, as you think about how do we make this a defensible investigation, you have to put some checks in place wherever you can to make sure you're reviewing the right data. So, for example, you identify all of the contacts. And giving a hypothetical, identify all the contacts who are work-related or could be work-related, make sure you pull all of those, and then do some spot checks on the remainder. And in my experience, people are usually more comfortable with spot checks. And you can identify the messages with someone's spouse pretty easily, and if it's appropriate, you can avoid those. Same sort of spot checking with certain messaging apps, if you can do it. But I'm really kind of speaking in generalities, but this has to take all of the considerations into account in the exact scenario. But as I said before, the main objective here is what is going to be the most effective to make sure you get the information you need for the investigation.
Yep, and Steve too. I'm sure you've dealt with this with clients. How do you navigate?
Just every case. A day doesn't go by where I don't have coffee or I don't discuss privacy concerns with clients. And it's real. It's legit and it's fair. I have 3 daughters. I have a wife, and I'm very concerned about their privacy and their devices and their data sources, and whether it's pictures or whether it's behavioral attributes or whether it's content or text messages or whatever. People have a right to privacy. And there's always that concern about big brother. So I think that we need to, as Brock said, be very sensitive to it. And this is where, when it's a dispute and you have a meet and confer or agreed upon protocol, sometimes you can battle through that to get to an answer. When it's an investigation, though, then it's a lot of bedside manner. You need to describe to people that we are doing things that is not going to allow for a man-in-the-middle attack. So everything we can do that's more scientific, everything that we can do that puts it into a black box and then comes up with, I always call it rules. Like, I get that someone doesn't want to hand me their phone and let me look at all their stuff. Rest assured, I don't have time for that. So I'm not going to be looking at anything because I'm so busy going to the next project. So instead, if we can explain to them scientifically how we go about getting a bit-by-bit image or a full extraction, putting it into a secure area that's air gap, not touching the internet so no one can hack into it and grab it. And then we only, whatever Brock tells me he wants to search for, those search terms, those are the only things I'm looking for. And then I'll take that data, and sometimes we'll even allow the custodian then to review it before Brock gets it back in front of him to look at. So there are ways to skin that proverbial cat and handle it, but I think you need to be aware technologically of how to do that. And then I think you need to be sensitive to people's concerns because they're real and they're not unfair.
Absolutely. And like you said, communicating those what preservation techniques you're putting in, or what data privacy, like you said, a black box, like communicating that, I think, and also I think validating the concerns of the person who is asking about it. So Those are all really, really great points. And also trying to explain the technical piece as best you can to somebody who's not technical as well. A question I do have, and Brock, I think this one will go to you, is about preservation notices. When we think about data and wanting to make sure that data is preserved, what is a preservation notice and how important is that in an internal investigation?
So I think it's one of the first steps that you need to consider in an investigation. A preservation notice is a notice to all the individuals in the company who could have relevant data that they need to not delete anything. I also think it's very important simultaneously to take whatever IT steps you can take on the back end to make sure there's no automatic deletion of data. If you have employees who leave during the course of the investigation, you want to make sure that the company has a process so that when that person turns in their laptop, it's just not deleted as can be just protocol for a lot of companies. So I think that those preservation steps should be in place. But as I said before, what we're always looking at is what is most productive, what is going to be effective in getting to the bottom of the investigation and reaching your objectives. And something you have to consider in certain circumstances is to the extent to which a preservation notice could alarm some people. And given where a particular company is located, maybe it's very far from the flagpole on the other side of the world, and maybe they're not as used to notices such as this, and it could actually precipitate people getting rid of data. And so you certainly don't want that. So you have to think about that, and you have to apply that balance as to whatever is going to ensure that the data is preserved to the extent it can be.
Well, from a strategic standpoint, though, as you're saying, if there's a possibility that, let's say, this is a global company and the data that you're needing is not located where you are, and there's a concern that it could be deleted. I mean, would this be a scenario where you would alert Steve would ensure that the data is being collected on the back end and then send the preservation notice out? Like, that's just wondering if strategically that would be something that could work.
That could work. I think whatever you can collect from the back end as quickly as possible, that's always a great strategic step. The other thing too is to have someone like Steve come in and they're on site, just start collecting laptops. Obviously that can create some disruption. And you got to think about whether that's warranted and what the second order effects could be. But that's something that may be appropriate in certain circumstances, is to just start collecting devices. Something else to consider there is, will that spread the alarm? Is that the most productive thing to do? That's also a challenge with decentralized workforces since the pandemic. It can be hard for a person like Steve to descend on a place and do a quick collection if people are in different locations. But yes, you're exactly right, Gina. As an initial step, going back to the very beginning of this conversation of sequencing, I think it's helpful to know at the very beginning what is available on the back end and what isn't.
I would add one thing, as whenever I'm brought into situations, this kind of follows a continuum from policy to programmatic. So the better companies do a job of having a policy in place, just like bring your own device to work or computers that are sitting at people's homes, when people are put on notice that, hey, when we have a dispute, I'm going to need to get a bit by bit image of your computer. I'm going to need to get a physical extraction from your phone. Can you please sign off on that? And they do, and you have that policy in place. Makes Steve's life way easier later, that we're not coming in covertly or SWAT team to do things. When you get into this programmatic, you get into legal hold. And when you're working on large installations like M365, it's pretty darn easy to get to email and get to SharePoint and OneDrive and Teams messages. The old days when we went out with Pelican cases, and 20 years ago, planes, trains, and automobiles, and we had to go and sit there and watch asphalt dry or watch a computer image, it might take you a whole day to get a single artifact. Now, the beauty of it, even though people are disparate and they're remote and everything, is now there's remote technology. So we can land data, targeted or full images behind the firewall by streaming it, or we can send out like remote kits to people and collect the data. Once again, communication, agreement, policy, if you have those things in place, makes all this way easier.
One thing I'll add to that is
Sure.
about the understanding the factual landscape and whether whatever it is that you're investigating could be ongoing, and knowing how when the investigation starts, you may have technical capabilities to be recording on an ongoing basis. So, for example, maybe if the company is based in New York, it's no problem to log the relevant people's emails in real time and make sure that there's nothing that can possibly be deleted. But for the subsidiary in India, there are a lot more technical hoops to jump through to make sure that you can do that. And so I think that goes back to the collaboration of speaking with the IT teams in various locations to maximize what you can get from the back end, maximize what you can, sometimes we call it journaling in real time going forward, so that you can have additional peace of mind that nothing is being deleted.
These are such great tips, and I think it goes right into the next section that I wanted to talk about, which is conquering diverse data formats and devices, where we've been talking about pretty much this entire time. But let's really drill down into like the intersection of e-discovery and internal investigations. And when you think about what are the things keeping you up at night when it comes to data, Steve, you mentioned a few things, whether we're talking about Microsoft Teams, but what are some of the things that are keeping you up around data types, diverse data types, and, talking even about, I think about using messenger apps like Signal, WhatsApp, anything like that. Can you touch upon that a little bit?
Sure. So I think the first thing is when people think of a phone, they think of a computer, and they're not the same. A computer has an operating system with loose files on it. And although there's an operating system on phones, it's a structured database. So think SAP or Oracle or SQL. It's usually a SQLite database. And so there's data that we have to extract out. When you hold it up and look at it, it looks like there's a document in front of you on that phone, but the reality is it may be in a table or a database that we have to get data out of. The other thing is whether it's an iPhone, iOS technology, or Android, there may or may not be the ability to collect certain classes of data or the totality of the data because of encryption. So you say, what keeps me up? Encryption's one, self-regulated encryption, then corporate encryption, and sometimes encryption by service providers. So in the Apple database, there's certain of these messaging platforms that are in the encrypted part of the data that we can't get to. So it does matter whether we're talking about Viber or whether we're talking about WeChat or WhatsApp or Discord or Telegram or whatever flavor of communication or collaboration we're dealing with. When people say to me, can you get to it? I always say my latest CLE, which is, it depends. And I used to hate that answer when I first heard it and I was growing up in the business because I thought it should be very black and white, very scientific. But the reality is you need to understand that two different phone platforms and then a whole series of different communication platforms have differing abilities. Literally, we had a case with WhatsApp where we collected it and we found out like a year into the case that even though one of the biggest forensic companies in America had told us, sure, we can do this. We use a QR code. You can go ahead and collect the data, go to the browser. We did it. We gave it to the attorney and they're like, hey, this only has a year back. So we went back to the company and we're like, hey, what happened here? We only got a year worth of data. And they said, oh, yeah, well, that's a caveat that you only get a year. I said, well, you need to tell people that because it's kind of important when you're collecting things. So it's when people ask me, like, can you get stuff off a phone? Can you get things out of a messaging platform? How does ephemeral data work? It depends. You really need to understand the nuances of it.
And how are you using technology to increase the speed, security, accuracy of results at key stages in the investigations process?
Boy, we have more arrows in our quiver. We have hundreds of either homegrown and off-the-shelf tools that we use, scripting, parsing, DevOps, plus everything under the sun you can buy. Because frankly, you don't know if it's going to take a sledgehammer or a tweezer. So you need to bring a lot of tools. You think about the plumber coming to the house and every single time they have all the joints and all the pieces you need. I mean, it's amazing, but we need to be the same way in forensics. And it's why when people in the IT side, they're like, oh, we can do it. And maybe they can in a lot of cases, but I'll bet you dollars to donuts that there's certain matters where it's that 17th or 183rd tool that we use that is the necessary one, because data is so different. And every day that goes by, it's more privatized. And then people change securities and they change APIs and connectors. And what we can collect today may not be what we can collect tomorrow. I've seen it happen numerous times where we're downloading LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram, and all of a sudden the next day it's disabled by the owners of the company.
Well, and I think that that actually does speak a segue again into something else. And this is about handling ephemeral data and mobile data. Brock, I'd like to talk to you about that. When we're talking about ephemeral apps, can you talk a little bit about what that means?
Sure. So these are messaging apps that are set for the content to disappear and be basically totally unrecoverable after a certain amount of time. So
what Steve basically was saying. Sorry to interrupt, but yeah, kind of what Steve was saying, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But this obviously presents a challenge. You asked what keeps investigators up at night. It's the potential to lose evidence that can't be recovered or is very difficult to retrace. And so I think these present particular challenges for investigators, not just identifying the apps that someone uses and making sure that you know where to look, but your ability to get this material in time. Now, something that is often relevant here is what the company's policies are related to ephemeral messaging. More and more companies are developing tight controls and procedures around when ephemeral messaging may be used, if at all, related to company business. And insofar as you are looking to draw conclusions in an investigation, that's something important to compare against. The only thing else I'll add on this is that this is just another item to where it's very important at the outset of an investigation to identify all of the relevant data, whether it's through custodial interviews, whether it's just through your experience having looked around this corner before as to what types of material may be out there. But ephemeral messaging needs to be top of mind for collection.
Yeah, and also what you were saying about documenting process, like document, what was collected, what was not collected, why. So again, if this comes back later, you're able to back that up. So I think that's really important points. Steve, when you're thinking about these messages that are designed to disappear, what is it? What is it that you see that's the biggest problem? Is it that the company doesn't have a policy in place? Like, what do you see as the biggest challenge around that for an investigation?
I think Brock hit it. Is that what is the policy? I was at a conference last year. I spoke at a national Ediscovery conference where there were 4 judges there, and they had a judges panel. They talked about this notion of ephemeral data or transient data. And basically they said the utilization of it by custodians inherently, I don't want to say made them guilty, but, basically the onus was on them, the fact that they chose to use those. Interestingly enough, I have Signal on my phone because I had clients that wanted to use Signal. I didn't even know what it was. So I installed it and I used it. And if you go back to my phone today, and I did this the other day and looked at it, all my messaging is there. So it's not necessarily, it's a setting issue is really what it is. It's these allow you, it's not Mission Impossible where it blows up in your hands when he gets done reading the message. It's really that it's a setting that allows you to make it transient, much like Snapchat with pictures when kids started using it, was the idea that it disappeared within a few seconds, but then anti-forensics came in and people were taking screenshots of everything that people were posting. And so they were retaining it. In the same way, you can retain Signal or Telegram or Viber or WeChat or whatever by taking screenshots of it and or taking syncs or backups of data. So these are really settings that allow people to keep a very short leash on data. And I think then it gets to what is policy like from a corporation standpoint. I think it'd be really bad policy to have everyone on a leash of 15 minutes or 30 minutes of communications. I don't think that would ever be appropriate. So then it's a matter of when it's BYOD and you're bringing your own device to work, what's acceptable. The more you can make these decisions up front, the more you can create policies that people live by, the easier it is to herd the cats later when you're trying to collect data.
Absolutely. And we have about that's my timer. We have about 5 minutes left. And I would like to spend those 5 minutes talking about generative AI. And really, it's the buzzword of the buzz phrase, I think, of the time we are in. We have some statistics here that, up on the screen, talking about 72% of legal professionals who say the industry is not ready for the impacts of generative AI. 40% of legal professionals say they are already using or planning to use such tools. So interesting statistic from our Everlaw Innovation Report. How are you seeing AI being used here in investigations? Is there a place for it in investigations? Brock, let's start with you. Or have you been using it, or do you see a place for it?
I do see potential. I think that the potential really can come out in the scoping phase. So as I mentioned before, it's, I think, very important to get your arms as much around the facts as possible early on. And so insofar as there are AI programs that could summarize a large batch of documents or documents between certain custodians to start developing a narrative from which you can then start developing some investigative theories, I think that's important. We've also had assignments here where we have, you'll have attorneys look at various important emails. You see who's talking to who. You kind of draw those charts of of connecting the dots. I see potential for AI to do that much more quickly. I also see potential for AI to, instead of maybe the predictive coding model that requires human review first, AI may be able to, again, summarize some of those documents that hit on what are going to be the most important keys early on. And so I think that there is still a ways to go in terms of insight, analysis, and so forth from AI. But I do think there's tremendous potential for it to be a time saver.
Yeah, for you and for the client too. Absolutely.
Yes, it very, very much driving efficiency and cost effectiveness for the client.
Yep.
And I would say that the biggest thing I can see is really that review. When you get to the managed review, you get the hosting of terabytes of data. And you think about, for a while, what we did is we had practitioners, lawyers looking at it, and then they started using temporary lawyers because the price point was lower. And then they decided to go overseas because they thought the price point might be there. I think AI, as it relates to getting to the goal line faster in terms of data. So the same way that TAR, technology assisted review, came out, and continuous active learning, I think this is the next level, is AI that can get you to the data faster. I think that's the key. And I'm not saying I can do it, but I know there's lots of people out there that are developing tools and techniques that companies that are e-discovery platforms and review platforms will eventually adopt. Because I think the idea is, if you can review only 2% or 7% or 12% of the corpus of data, that's the key, versus having humans having to go through 50 to 70 to 80% of the data that's sitting there.
Absolutely. And when we think about that number that I mentioned, the stat earlier, that 72% of legal professionals are just not prepared for the impact of generative AI. I mean, 5 years from now, that number will likely be different. What do you think in-house teams can do to be prepared for this 5 years down the road? Brock, any insights on that?
Yeah, I think that in-house teams, as they become familiar with the capabilities of generative AI, they will make that part of the dialogue when they select their outside counsel and they talk through the work plan and say, you talked about the importance of achieving this quickly. How can we use technology tools to do that? And making that part of the discussion, I think, is a very fair question.
All right. Well, we're getting to the end, but I'd like to leave our audience with a few takeaways. So, Steve, what would you like the audience to remember from this webinar?
I always say, the old joke was, when you have the facts on your side, argue facts. When you have the the law on your side, argue law. And when you have neither on your side, we used to say lawyers just argued, but now what they do is they really argue about process. And so I think, if there's anything that's a takeaway, I think a thoughtful, informed process. I think if you sit down with people, and it doesn't have to be a Steve or a Brock, but people like them that can help guide you with putting that fence around the field so it is finite. And then I think the other thing, when you talked about generative AI utilization, is be open to new tools and techniques, whether it's TAR, continuous active learning, or whether it's a new phone program that you can push out, or an agent you push out across a computer to collect data. There's lots of things out there. I think being open, adaptable, and then understanding that it is not necessarily what it appears sometimes in terms of what we're up against. We really don't know until we dig into it. And then we have to make informed decisions. So I find conversations, like I said the other day when we chatted, that I usually learn as much as I give to anybody. I take away more. And so it's interesting to hear other professionals' perspectives on things. And I think that collaboration notion is kind of the key to any type of successful investigation.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Brock, I'm going to give you the last word.
Great. Well, as we were going, I jotted down, consistent with the slide, 5 key takeaways. So one, I think it's very important to have a deliberate work plan where you have very well thought out objectives, and any changes to those should be deliberate too. Second, scoping is your friend in an investigation. And so I think that dovetails with what we were talking about of the potential for AI and ways to accelerate that. 3 is to be ready for data collection and readability snafus, whether it's data that may come up in another language that you need to be able to search, or format issues. If it's a type of document that you don't have the software to open, you should be able to look around those corners to make sure that the investigation isn't delayed. 4, as we talked about, memorialize the process. And then last, maybe this is too lawyerly to offer a caveat at the end, but there's no one size fits all approach to an investigation. There are risk-based decisions along the way. There are practical decisions along the way. And at the end of the day, you just need to keep your eyes on what is going to be the most effective to meet your objectives.
Well said. Well said. Well, thank you both. I really, it's been my pleasure to chat with you about corporate investigations, internal investigations, and walk through this with you. So thank you both for your time, Brock and Steve. This was great. And thank you to the audience for joining us. If you have any further questions for us, please, our email addresses are up here. You can send us a message. And if not, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.